It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I am Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. We have a soul-transferring episode for you this week as I take a look at the fourth film in Hammer's Frankenstein series, 1967's Frankenstein Created Woman. Now, I think there's no easy way to put this. The legacy of this movie is rather mixed. Some critics, like Leonard Maltin, thinks this is really, really bad. Others think this is one of the more interesting movies in the Hammer Frankenstein franchise. In fact, maybe among their favorites of any of the Hammer horror films. So, some fans even think that, like I said, this is among the best, and certainly some of the technical aspects of this movie became well regarded. It's a really good looking movie. The most surprising of all praise given to this movie comes from Martin Scorsese. In 1987, he included this as a part of a National Film Theater series of his favorite films, and he considers the premise of this movie dealing with the soul as opposed to the brain or the physical part of resurrection to be something sublime. Okay, who am I to argue with Martin Scorsese, right? But the movie was actually in line to be a follow-up to the 1958 film, The Revenge of Frankenstein. At that time, that film was in production. The French film And God Created Woman was very popular. A version of this movie was floated as And Then Frankenstein Created Woman, but it was held off for 9 years, essentially almost a full decade. Now, one key element for this movie would be who would be the woman who Frankenstein quote-unquote creates. Well, the woman chosen was Susan Denberg, a German-Austrian model and actress. And in 1966, she was Miss August in Playboy magazine. And she also appeared as one of Mudd's women in that Star Trek episode of the same name. And this would be her second film and her last. After making Frankenstein Created Woman, she left Hollywood and returned to Austria. And from there, her story would get a little interesting. It was incorrectly reported by several sources that she had died in the late 60s, and that wasn't true. In fact, at the time of recording this, she's still alive. And in 1968, she did an interview discussing how she fell into drug and alcohol addiction since returning to Austria. She specifically stated that LSD was something that really messed her up. In 1971, she gave birth to a son, and then worked as a topless waitress at an adult theater in Vienna. She also worked as a showgirl, too. So she has a bit of an interesting career. But let's see how she does in this movie, shall we? The movie begins with a guillotine. This is actually something that recurs quite a bit during the course of this movie. You see this specific spot. A man is executed for the crime of murder, and his son, Hans, witnesses his father being executed from afar. Now, years later, Hans is working for Dr. Frankenstein, and every time that he goes to work for Frankenstein at Frankenstein's place, he passes the very guillotine that he watched his father be executed at. Now, I mentioned when I did The Evil of Frankenstein that movie was not in continuity with the first two films, but this one is apparently in continuity with that one because obviously Frankenstein had survived the destruction of his castle. I think you could potentially argue that The Evil of Frankenstein was a standalone movie, and this is actually technically the third movie. Again, it was originally meant to be the sequel to the follow-up to The Revenge of Frankenstein, but I digress. He's been doing various experiments, basically testing how close he can get to death and still be revived. In this experiment, he was seemingly frozen for exactly 1 hour And Hans and Frankenstein's other assistant / partner, Dr. Hertz, is using electric jolts to basically bring him back from death. Frankenstein agrees that he was dead for an hour, but his soul had apparently not left his body, which seemingly plays into how he was able to be revived. I think he figures, well, the body's death, the physical death, is not permanent as long as the soul doesn't ultimately leave the body to go into the afterlife, I suppose. But Hans has a local girl that he fancies named Christina, which is interesting because even though this is Frankenstein's movie, you could argue that Christina is actually the lead character in this movie. But Christina is the daughter of the local innkeeper, Cleve. Now, Cleve is kind of a turd. He's a little bit too easy to be pushed around. He oftentimes doesn't accept payment, or at least doesn't receive payment, and never seems to shut off service, especially to depending on the class of the person who comes in and takes his service for granted. He definitely does not want Hans hanging out with Christina by any means necessary. But Christina has a disfigured left side of her face, and the left side of her body is also paralyzed. But otherwise, she's actually very pretty. 3 dandy gentlemen come into Cleve's inn as Hans is leaving with a bottle of champagne to celebrate Frankenstein's successful resurrection, I suppose. Now, if Cleve is a turd, these guys are even worse. They specifically want to be served by Christina because they like picking on her for her paralysis and her disfigurement. It's a weird and very cruel game they play by picking on her and then threatening her father to lose his license for his inn if she messes up. And when Christina inevitably spills wine on the ringleader's fancy suit, he berates her, which leads to Hans defending her honor. He gets in some good licks on these creeps and ultimately slashes the leader's face, but he's restrained by the constables. And after they usher him out, after Cleve opts not to basically press any charges and kind of insinuates that maybe the slash on the one guy's face is Hans kind of doing that in self-defense. He ends up ultimately sending Christina home, where Hans visits her. Now, Christina says that her father spends all of his money on doctors to try to essentially fix her, but she knows it's hopeless. But she dreams of one day being able to walk about the streets without hiding her left side of her body. And Hans says that she would never have to hide around him, which then leads to them making love. Later, as they lay in bed, the dandies walk under her window and call up and serenade her to continue their cruel game. Now, Hans wants to kill them, but Christina convinces him to basically stay in bed with her, and they fall back asleep after they leave. Now, after Cleve closes the inn to go home, the dandies break into the inn for one more drink. And when they drunkenly reveal that they are hiding in within the inn, when Cleve has to return to get his house keys, they jump him and ultimately kill him by beating him with their canes. The next morning, Hans sends Christina off by coach to see the doctor that her father wanted her to be sent to. And when he walks past the inn, he sees the commotion of the locals gathered around and the police. And he's arrested for the murder of Cleve because of the events of the night before when he lost his temper. He won't reveal that he spent the night with Christina, as they were not married and what have you. But so he's immediately arrested for murder, put on trial, because of the various other circumstantial evidence on the scene. Now, naturally, the fact that his father was a murderer makes the lead constable basically think that he's no different, like father, like son. That age-old stereotype, right? Now, Frankenstein himself says Hans is very unlikely to have committed the crime of murder because of his work ethic. However, the constable is successful in forcing Frankenstein's hand to say that he can't really say it is impossible that Hans would not murder someone. The dandies, of course, testify that Hans is a murderer, and his refusal to say where he was at the time of the murder essentially seals his fate. He's found guilty and will be executed first thing the very next morning. Now, Frankenstein, frankly, sees this as an opportunity to do his experiment. He tells Hertz to retrieve Hans's body no later than 1 hour after his execution so that he can basically take the soul out of Hans's body and then find another body to transport it into. Christina returns from the doctors just too late to help Hans. She witnesses the only man who will love her get executed. Distraught, she runs off, throws herself from a bridge, and kills herself. So now Frankenstein has the soul of Hans to transfer to a fresh body, Christine's. He's the luckiest guy in the world, right? While they prepare to transfer Hans's soul into Christine's body, Hertz has time to repair Christine. He flushes the water from her lungs. He ultimately fixes her face, and she even becomes a blonde bombshell. And when revived, she asks who she is. And after seeing her face, she once again tries to understand, who is she really? Now, Frankenstein and Hertz won't directly tell her her real identity, not until they can do some other experiments on her psyche and see how she's essentially holding up with this transfer. Now, the first place they take her to is the guillotine. And when she sees it, she shouts, "Papa," which is Hans remembering what he saw as a child. And while she sleeps off the shock of what she experienced, she ultimately wakes up and sneaks out of Frankenstein's house. While Anton, the head dandy that Hans slashed and ultimately told the authorities that Hans no doubt killed Cleve, he's walking down the street and Christine uses Hans's voice to call out to him. And after he gets drunk to take the edge off of what he thinks is him being haunted, he then sees an even more beautiful Christina waiting for him. And it doesn't help his case that he continues to make fun of Christina while she herself is taking him to a place to, kind of sex him up a little bit. Now he begins to hear Hans's voice telling her to kill. And she moves, which she does, and then she moves on to the next friend, Carl, to seduce him before hearing Hans's voice and beckoning to Christina to kill him, which she does with a meat cleaver. The third dandy, Johann, begins to suspect that Hans has returned from the grave, which is confirmed by by Carl's own, his own body having, before he died, apparently in his own blood, spelled out Hans's name. Now, the town is starting to mob up a little bit. They go to Frankenstein to accuse him of witchcraft, and they threaten to burn him. But he takes the mob to the cemetery where they dig up Hans's body. The body is there, but the head is not in the coffin as Christina speaks to it, and it speaks to her to tell her what she must do next. Now, Frankenstein knows that Hans is seeking revenge through her, and Johann tries to flee from whatever or whoever killed his friends while the constables question Frankenstein. Now, when Johann gets on the coach, he finds Christina waiting for him. When one of the horses throws a shoe, she convinces Johann to get out of the coach and walk through the forest the rest of the way to their destination. Frankenstein, meanwhile, has escaped the police to attempt to stop Christina from killing Johann. He arrives just too late to discover that she has stabbed him to death and is speaking with Hans's voice at his own head, which she carries around with her. He tells her that she can now rest in peace. And when she discovers that Frankenstein has witnessed the aftermath of her killing Johann, she runs away, realizing that, realizing all that she has done, realizing what she really needs to do at this point. She decides to throw herself into the rushing river, once again, killing herself. Now let's talk about the three things I like about Frankenstein Created Woman. First, man, those uppity dandies who pick on Christine are just the worst, aren't they? I mean, they're the kind of villains in a movie or TV show that you just love to hate. They're not even really full characters, right? They're stereotypes of rich, well-to-do, supposedly, quote-unquote, noble men. They hold power over people because of their parents, not because they're worth a shit. Sometimes you just have to have cartoonish villains, right? You don't need to know anything about them, because to know them might endanger you to actually kind of care about them outside of their place to be pieces of the plot, as well as being pieces of shit. But Stephen King is really good at using characters like these in his stories. So it only makes sense that he has some regard for this movie as well. And he probably even got the idea of having these types of cartoonishly mean characters and use them constantly. But better yet, they get their comeuppance too. So it gives you even more to like about my second topic. And that is, next, I very much like Susan Denberg as Christina. Pretty, yes, of course. But beyond that, especially in the first part of the movie, she is incredibly sympathetic. If the dandies are so easy to hate, it makes her so easy to like. This poor girl is kind of kept in the back of her father's inn. He's right to not make her be a waitress or anything, because, she has a hard enough time getting around, because of her paralysis. Her face is also disfigured, but not so ugly that Hans and the audience really dislikes her for any reason in terms of physicality, right? In the final act, once she is essentially reborn as kind of both Christina and Hans, she's much more alluring, but I love how her first couple of scenes after being revived has her trying to figure out who she really is. She constantly is asking, who am I? It's a really good performance that is every bit as sympathetic as it is surprisingly just as lovable and alluring, even in her original quote-unquote disfigured state. Lastly, I do agree with those who like this entry quite a bit that this is a completely and totally different angle on Frankenstein's experiments. That's a really interesting element to this movie. Okay, we know the physical concept of life and death, right? That's easy to measure and work with. Frankenstein's desire to either create life or revive life has been the basis of that character for effectively hundreds of years now. However, the concept of a soul being transferred, or how the presence of a soul after death, is a much higher brow concept and idea. It begs the question, if the soul is trapped in a body based on being cursed or held by some other purpose, what if that could be transferred to another vessel? Would that be the same person? Would it revive the person whose body is being used, or would it create a brand new person? Or what happens if you have two souls in the same body? We know that they didn't take Christina's soul out because she has this kind of double-edged idea of who she is. She is both Christina and Hans. It's kind of a gender-bending performance in a way too, or at least character, because she's both herself and the man that she loved who loved her. And they're fighting over this body, essentially. But Frankenstein was always compared to God, or in Mary Shelley's original book, the subtitle has something to do with Prometheus. Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus is what I think the original title was. But he was always compared to something higher, and his tampering with these things that seem almost sacrilegious was always on the physical side. And now it's metaphysical. He determines that the soul does not leave the body at the time of death, and he wants to remove the soul from the physically dead body, repair the body, and then return it to that repaired body. Thus, as he puts it, would totally conquer death. Now, beyond all the conquering that he's already done with reviving dead bodies and the like that we've seen in the previous entries, but it's a little bit deeper than the other Frankenstein stories. And off the top of my head, I don't know of another type of story like this with the Frankenstein title. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky to get all the updates of all the shows as they drop. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Wednesday morning Film Seizure podcast and the Monday afternoon Monster Monday show at your favorite podcast providers. We also upload the stuff to YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next week, we call up two recognizable names, Edgar Allan Poe and Roger Corman, for 1961's The Pit and the Pendulum. Until next week, stay spooky.